Hey guys, in foraging, one thing you'll learn really quickly, and sometimes the hard way, is that the term edible does not mean good. That's not good. Of all the categories that I like to get into, whether it's bugs or mushrooms, by the way, bugs, I don't know that I've ever tasted one that really tasted bad. I got like 6 glasses full of bees, and that's what we're eating for dinner.
These are really freaking good.
But that's not true with wild plants. The majority of them taste pretty awful. But it's not 100%. There are those jewels out there. There are those that are actually quite phenomenal and can stand up on the shelves of any grocery store. They're unique, delicious, available, and that's what this video is about. This video is a list of my 5 favorite wild edible plants. And just a couple details, to be on this list, I am looking at the greens only. I'm not looking at the blossoms. I'm not talking about nuts, berries, roots, or any of that. I'm talking about greens. Yeah. These plants need to be easy to identify, readily available in decent quantity, so you don't have to go climb a mountain to go find some random plant that tastes delicious. They need to be safe to eat, and most of all, they need to be delicious. A little quick disclaimer, always start by trying new plants. Start in small quantity. That way, if you do have a reaction, you don't exacerbate it. I think that's a word. It sounds naughty, but I think it's the right word. Make sure you use multiple channels of identification, especially if you're new to foraging. Exacerbate. There's no T in there. Okay. I was getting ready to serve a friend seared curly dock, and right before I gave it to him, I remembered he had gout. And the oxalic acid in the curly dock probably would have been quite an irritant for a person with gout. Even though it's perfectly edible to everybody else, conditions you have sometimes make you a little more sensitive to certain food. Anyway, here's my list. 5 most delicious edible plants. No, that's 10. 5 that you can find. Number 1 on the list. What's it gonna be? Ramps. The wild leek plant, commonly known as the ramp, Allium trichicum. Trichicum. Widespread across Canada and the United States. It's a perennial that produces 2 to 6 centimeter bulbs that give rise to broad, flat, smooth, light green leaves that grow to a max of about 30 centimeters in height. The bulbs will often be a brilliant white color. They tend to grow in clustered clumps on hillsides and near water. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a nice patch of ramps near you, you'll want to be careful not to mix them up with lilies or especially irises. And the easiest way to make sure you don't have one of those similar looking species is just to give it a smell test. If it smells oniony or garlicky, then you got something safe to eat. Jackpot. You do want to be careful not to over-harvest this one. As a general rule of thumb, harvest no more than 20% of a patch. At this rate, you should see the patch still able to grow in size. I usually find that right about the time morel season is ending is just about the best time for harvesting ramps. Now, the most common and my go-to way of eating ramps is ramp soup. I love it because I can bring home enough ramps to can soup that'll last me most of the year. But other great ways include just searing them in butter, or one I'm really excited to try is ramp pesto that I've read about in this book right here. Great book, by the way. It really is a mild, diverse, and easy to eat plant. It's something that has such a pleasant flavor that's really rare in nature. It is a plant that you can occasionally find in grocery stores, especially if you live in the Appalachian region, but most of the time this is going to be one you're going to have to go out and find yourself. So if you get the opportunity to get out in the woods, watch those hillsides in the early to late spring, and see if you can find some ramps for yourself.
Oh, that is so good. The next one, let's see. Oh, here we go. Look at you. This is a contender for maybe the best tasting wild green of all. This plant is Purslane.
Purslane sprawls along the ground. It is a succulent with highly branched stems. The stems are round and tinted red. The flavor of the raw stem is mild and slightly sour, and the texture is crunchy. The leaves are paddle-shaped, flat and alternately arranged. The small flowers are yellow and contain 2 lobed petals. Purslane grows all around the world. It loves disturbed soil, and it's often found as a weed in your garden beds, especially in sandy soil, and if you use straw as a mulch. This succulent, low-growing plant is very tasty and crunchy. Purslane can be used as the main ingredient just by lightly seasoning it with some onion, vinegar, and oil. The plant is good cooked with soups, steamed, sautéed, or, my personal favorite, pickled. As a wild forage, I find it's a little uncommon until you find it. You gotta be looking in the right places. This one likes being around where people have disturbed the soil. My little tip for finding this plant, look where hay fields are planted. It loves growing in and around the disturbed soil of hay fields. And if you find one where you know there's no pesticides being sprayed, that's your ideal choice for location of harvest. The plant also has one really neat characteristic in that it changes flavor throughout the course of the day, with the early morning the plant being very sour and sweet and becoming much more mild in flavor as the day progresses. This has to do with the malic acid building up over the night.
This is a very crunchy herb, and it's got a sweet kind of citrusy flavor. The look-alike for purslane. Now, I think it looks quite a bit different. I don't remember the plant's name, but it is supposed to be pretty toxic. Honestly, it looks fairly unappealing if you ask me.
Anything but the number 3. Wild violets. The violet's a member of the Violaceae family. Violaceae. Violaceae family. There's 830 different species out there of viola. A lot of them are cultivated, so not necessarily all wild. I imagine they go to church on Sunday, wear long dresses. Very domesticated. That's not what we're talking about. Wild violets. Wild, wild violets couldn't take me away. Violet leaves can be variable in shape, but most often are heart-shaped. The flowers can be white, yellow, pink, or rose, but the characteristic purple is what they're most famous for. The leaves and blooms are edible, and it should be noted that the roots and crowns are toxic, so those should not be eaten. The best method for harvest of the green is to either pick them or to use a pair of scissors and cut them off at ground level. The reason this one is on the list is because it makes a base for a salad better than any other. These perennials have a wide variety of habitats, but generally prefer shady, moist places. Violets can be added to soups and egg dishes, jams, jellies, and wine. Taste a lot like baby spinach to me. It can be difficult to collect enough flowers to make a jelly, so I recommend harvesting early in spring when the violets first start to grow. You'll find there's a massive flush when they all grow and blossom at once, making harvest really easy. After that, the harvest of the blossoms can be fairly sporadic. The leaves can become a little bit fibrous as they grow too, so older leaves can be cut off and new leaves will replace it. And this can be done any time of year to encourage fresh young growth.
It's number 4.
There it is. We're here.
Curly Dock. All y'all that watch this channel knew we were going to get to this one, didn't you? If you follow the channel, you know I've done several videos on this. In fact, some people have told me I like Curly Dock too much. It has a citrusy flavor. Again, it's a plant that has a little bit of oxalic acid in it, which is what gives it the sour flavor. But it can taste like asparagus. It can make a cooked green. You can even make a meat substitute out of it, which I am going to do a future video on at some point. So dock is found on agricultural land, on hillsides, a lot of times right next to roadsides, ditches, vacant lots. It has dark green lancelet-shaped leaves that are wavy or curly on the margin. They can measure up to a foot long. I think it's easily misidentified for horseradish if you're familiar with horseradish. Horseradish just usually grows a little later in the season, and curly dock tends to be a little more pronounced in the early spring. There are a couple of other dock plants you can easily mix it up for. Bitter dock, made that mistake once. Burdock and swamp dock. Now swamp dock is delicious as well. Burdock is edible. The greens aren't so good. It's typically eaten as a root crop. But bitter dock, you'll know if you make that mistake like I did.
It ain't good. It ain't good. Ugh, I ain't eating that.
It cans well as a cooked green. I think it's superior to spinach. Now there's a husk that surrounds the lower stalk, and when you peel it back, you'll notice a like a lubricant down there. Kind of seems like a water-based lubricant. In fact, I've used it to lubricate the spindle of my bow drill while starting a fire. Lubricant is a great identifier for it. Horseradish doesn't have that. Other dock plants do have it a little bit too. But all the other dock plants and the horseradish too are all edible, so it really doesn't have any dangerous lookalikes. Curly dock is the first sizable plant to emerge in the spring. You'll notice big clumps of it that'll pop up before the grass even turns green. It's not really advised to eat the leaves raw because of the oxalic acid content, although you can try them. I've eaten them that way a few times. Now I like to take the base and sear it like you would asparagus with a little bit of the leaf still on. That's my favorite way to cook this. The leaves get a little bit crunchy and crispy, and the base tastes like a delicious sour asparagus. I made something like a salsa out of it one year. It was really good. Also, last year we fermented it and made a kimchi type of substitute. It was quite good. The other great thing about this plant is it can be harvested so easily and in such quantity. If you are into prepping or food preservation, then this is the wild edible for you. To grow and collect a comparable amount of spinach would take an absurd amount of time. I know because we grow spinach in our garden every year, and every year I say, I'm gonna can spinach, and I manage to pick and put away enough to maybe have 1 jar of spinach. Whereas in an afternoon, I could put away 30 jars of canned curly dock.
That's for you, Gustav.
Number 5 is alive!
Now, before we officially introduce number 5, I think there are a couple of honorable mentions that should be pointed out. 1, wood sorrel for its flavor, and 2, lamb's quarter. You are hard to leave off the list because as an edible green, it really is top shelf. But there could only be 5, and diversity was a bit of this. I felt like lamb's quarter and wild violets kind of fill the same role. And so, number 5, stinking, stinging nettles. They set you on fire. They light you up. They wreck your world. But they taste so good. There are a lot of different nettle species. There's even some that I read that don't sting, but they're not known to live in the United States. In fact, they're subspecies of the nettle, Urdotica genodia, whatever it is. But there is a good lookalike in the United States that I run into pretty frequently. In fact, it took me a couple years to figure out that I was what it was. I knew I had something wrong when I was looking at it because it didn't sting. It lives by the water, and it had a slightly translucent stalk. And that was a plant I eventually learned was clearweed. It is related to stinging nettle, but it is a completely different plant. And it tastes god-awful. So you'll know if you get that one. It won't kill you, it'll taste terrible, and it won't sting you. Reaching up to 5 feet tall when mature, leaves arranged opposite to each other, covered in hair-like needles set to destroy your world. The inconspicuous tiny green flowers are formed in clusters and axils. Nettles, a perennial plant that grows all over the United States, commonly near water, is one of the most nutritious and delicious and readily available plants there is. It's rare to find an edible plant that's thriving under the dense canopy of the woods, but that's exactly where stinging nettles thrive. As a matter of fact, because of this, they have very little competition for their area, and they'll form such dense clusters that I truly believe one need only eat this plant and they could survive walking across this entire country. It can be eaten fresh, though there can be a little pain associated in doing so. It's best to use some gloves. It doesn't take very much heat at all to render the sting neutral. In fact, waving an entire plant in the fire is one effective way of doing it. When brushing up against the plant, the tips of numerous hair-like hypodermic needles will break off in your skin, releasing formic acid. This causes an immediate sensation of burning and itching, lasting anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. Though in my experience, it's best remedied by just rubbing water on it.
So there are 2 different areas on this plant which will administer the famous sting. The stem, and you can see all these little hypodermic needles sticking off of it. And the other is on the edge of the leaves. This is truthfully the one that gets you the most often when you're just walking through the woods, because when you graze your leg up against the sawtooth on the edge of the leaf, that's where most of the time it'll get you. So when you're walking through patches of this, I kind of do one of these where I'll try to push it down to the side, but still, those leaves every now and then get you and just light you up.
Nettles are not used in salads. They are generally used as a cooked vegetable or tea. The tender tops are collected and steamed and are delicious served with butter or as the base of a soup stock. Nettle spinach, nettle casserole, bread, lots of different uses for this one. But as a survivalist, when I go out into the woods, I can tell you anything I find thrown into a pot with stinging nettle and water is going to make a delicious soup. It's a fundamental piece of how I eat when I go on a survival trip. I always watch for stinging nettle, and I make sure to harvest a large quantity of it at the first chance I get. Now, on top of that, my family and I also keep dehydrated stinging nettle here for teas. Of all the herbs that have claimed medicinal responses, stinging nettle is probably the one I would say had the most pronounced effect. I have pretty bad hay fever, and I had a pretty bad allergic reaction going on one year, and I coincidentally poured a glass of nettle tea, and when I drank it, instantly I had relief. I didn't read till later that it was a what's that called? Antihistamine. Having seen the effects before I read about it really made me notice it. I will say this, it only lasted about 45 minutes before the symptoms came back, but the immediate response I had from drinking a nettle tea was absolutely substantial. It's also known by many as one of the most nutritious plants there is. It was Plato or Socrates, one of them old dudes, said there's two things that are of universal good in this world, garlic and nettles.
You know how to touch it without it hurting you, don't you, sweetie?